process of selecting this speaker, but it's a pretty important process, and faculty sit together and try to come up with who would fit the theme really well and who would really embody the honor of doing this and who stands out in the field. So I just wanted to share with you how we did it this year. And I'll share a little bit of the email I sent to Tom. I said, here's why we believe the only person who can appropriately deliver this address this year is you. It was rather remarkable that after I asked faculty to independently think about suggestions for the endowed keynote speaker, when we met face-to-face at a faculty meeting, one after the other, faculty members named you. Who else can possibly capture what we envision the keynote's message to be? What scholars more respected and more accomplished than you, especially when reflecting on the theme, recreation plays an integral role in cultures, communities, families, and individual lives. The students and faculty want someone who was a student of Gold, but not to tell anecdotes about him. We want the keynote to help the current generation understand what Gold stood for, see how his philosophies shaped and impacted this field, and not just outdoor recreation, not just therapeutic recreation, but the entire field. How he did indeed set the gold standard for society, and that it is our responsibility to continually strive to achieve that standard. We also want someone who can communicate Gold's message to all audience members, not just alumni of SUNY Cortland, because conference attendees come from all sorts of backgrounds, institutions, and agencies. Finally, your presence would resonate greatly with the words often associated with Gold. Stay consistently in the presence of the best in the sphere in which you seek attainment and make an honest response. Tom gave me this morning another gift to the department. Gold Metcalf's book called Whitland Whistles and Thingamajigs, and he wrote in it a message to Tom. I know, I'm sorry. To Tom Goodale, my beloved and respected student and friend. Because of his many talents and his using them increasingly in the service of others, I am very proud of him and always will be. He has made an honest response. Love sincerely, Harlan Gold Metcalf.
I have more hindsight than most of the people here, and I'm sorry to say that much of it is something that I should have learned at a much earlier time. Excuse me. It's born a white male, that's one, to hardworking parents, that's two, in Cortland, New York, where all children are free-range children. Having free ice cream while everybody else had World War II rations. Plus it's a college town, 5'6", and Gold Metcalf is here. That's 7 things that I should be grateful for. And I had nothing to do with most of it. When somebody observes that life isn't fair, I say, I know, I'm a beneficiary of that. But usually when we say it, we're talking about people for whom fortune has not smiled in the way it has smiled for me and for most of the people here. And I'm sure you all understand that you didn't get here by yourself. I certainly did not get here. Wouldn't have gotten into Cortland College without Gold Metcalf. So, we are all here blessed. A few people may not be. Good fortune has not smiled on them. They are here because of tenacity, and talent, and they owe even an extra share, we owe them an extra share of respect. Another lesson is that fairness, which is a synonym for justice, is probably our brightest star. Everybody believes in fairness. We don't all make that in a material way. We don't all actualize fairness in the same way, but we all believe in fairness. You go any place in the world and people say, I believe it should be fair. And I'm going to talk about justice, but one of the other lessons is that being a white male still means that we are dominant. But we are only 31% of the population. So we are wasting 69% of our talent. And we can't afford to do that. But Gold Metcalf gave me a chance to be at Cortland, where I got a very good education from people like Roseanne Brooks. You may have all heard of her, Faye Corey, after whom this union is named. They were my teachers and mentors. I met Robert Ditton and Jeffrey Godby, two of the most outstanding people in our field. We were friends for years and years and years, and that's all because of Gold Metcalf. And so when I hear stay persistently in the presence of the best, I said, I think I'm already here. Most of you know of Gold's love for Huntington and for the center, the Park Center for Environmental and Outdoor Education. Most of you know Gold's concern about people who had disabilities to make sure that they could have really fulfilling lives as well. You know less about the fact that Gold Metcalf was deeply tied to his community through the church, through the YM and YWCA at the time, through 100 youth-serving groups. He was a community-based, community-minded person. If Gold were here today, I am quite sure that his emphasis would be on community development, because this is something that has become more and more fragile. It is something that is more and more necessary. I think that's where Gold would be today. He would want to see, strengthening communities, indigenous leadership, safe gathering places for people, children and parents advocating for themselves and incidentally advocating for us as well, safe paths and lighting so that people could be engaged with others in a community, free to live wherever, and not isolated in cars, and not staring at screens in your room or in your pocket, but not isolated from your surroundings. But the gold standard was his belief in the inherent goodness and unlimited potential of his students. He made people better, me one of them, simply by believing in me. And he encourages students to believe in themselves. My oldest son teaches at a university in Boston, and I once told him that the secret of having a good program is to get good students and then get out of their way. And he said, there's one other step. And I said, what's that? And he says, get them to get out of their own way. And when Gold Metcalf looked at you, he didn't have to say a word, but what he is saying to you is, you can do this. You can do this. He voiced his philosophy, some mainly involving children in the outdoors, but mainly he lived his philosophy. Gold Metcalf was the compelling embodiment of what our field is entirely about. He lived his philosophy. He was a model as well as a mentor. He was teaching all the time, always positive, encouraging, curious, enthusiastic, even exuberant. There was a little boy in Gold Metcalf long after he retired, fortified by a department still infused with gold, with its accolades for inclusiveness, sustainable energy use, a healthy campus, soon a Cortica jug. Students leave here disciplined and capable of making discriminating moral choices between, for example, justice and injustice. You see it, you know what it is, you do something about it. Applying that discipline to our work as professionals, but also to our responsibilities as citizens. Rational thought demonstrating disciplined minds is the first of three characteristics that Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, said makes us uniquely human. Rationality, dignity, and autonomy. Rationality, dignity, and autonomy. In a book by John Rawls entitled A Theory of Justice, it goes back to 1971, he wrote about systems of thought, and there are many systems of thought in the sciences, in the humanities, in the arts. But in all of those systems, people are disciplined by in-depth study and by conducting pristine research. The essential virtue of a system of thought is the truth. Truth assures the integrity of knowledge. Remember this also. A person who does not know what is true cannot be free. Content perhaps, but not free. So over the portals of universities everywhere, you can find the words, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." There's an alternative. It was by Aldous Huxley. He said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you mad." So I guess that's my job this afternoon. Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "God offers to every mind the choice between truth and repose. Take what you wish, you can never have both." Truth being the gold standard of thought means that we have to take our cues for our decisions and actions from the evidence and not from the tribes in which so many of us are engulfed. Dark bots, talk radio, political propaganda, the narcosis of commercial and celebratory media. We are duty-bound to be skeptical. We are duty-bound to ask questions. When someone expresses opinion, you say, "That's very nice, but I really don't want to know what it's based on." Everybody has an opinion. Much of it is, I'm sorry, not worth listening to. Mark Twain once said that the problem is not only what we don't know, but what we do know that ain't so. But what we don't know is still a problem. For example, since 2005, we have lost in this country 2,000 newspapers. Most of them weeklies, some of them bi-weeklies, some of them some of them dailies, or perhaps only Sundays, like the New York Times on Sunday, which is like that thick. Creating 2,000 food deserts, food deserts, of course. 2,000 news deserts, very much like the food deserts that we all know are scattered about our land. Thomas Jefferson has to be turning in his grave because he said that the only safe depository for a democracy is an informed citizenry. That is the only place, depository for democracy. Also in A Theory of Justice, John Rawls talked about institutions, in fact, quite extensively, especially government and political institutions, and identified two principles by which to judge the legitimacy of any institution. Number one, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with the liberty of others. Second, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged in such a way as to be reasonably expected, to be to everyone's advantage. Arranged to be reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage. I have trouble with that one. And also at the same time attached to positions that are available to everyone equally. And those were the two gold standards for justice, the essential virtue which legitimizes institution. Our institutions are providing too little justice, leaving us sometimes less free rather than more. Truth in thought, justice in institutions establish and preserve freedom. We care about freedom and should, as the ancient philosophers understood, for this reason. While not all freely chosen activities are virtuous, only freely chosen activities can be. To ancients like Aristotle, of course, but this is Cicero, he said, leisure means the opportunity to engage in virtuous activities by which one grows morally, intellectually, and spiritually. When we speak of leisure, we usually mean freedom to do what we choose to do. Seldom do we think of freedom from. Freedom to and freedom from were clear, and some people may know of Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech given in January of 1941. It was a State of the Union address, and he spoke about four freedoms. Freedom from and freedom to. Freedom to speak and express oneself, and freedom to worship God in your own way. Freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Of the freedoms to, we have a superabundance. Of the freedoms from, we have a superdeficit. Freedom from want and freedom from fear are devastating the lives of millions of people in America. Justice Louis Brandeis served on the Supreme Court from 1916 to 1939. So he witnessed the accumulation of huge fortunes in the hands of a few people in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That's when Camp Huntington, Sagamore, and the other great camps were built in the Adirondacks. He watched the stock market crash in 1929. He watched the Depression unfold. And along the way, he concluded, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. But we cannot have both. As to freedom from want, there are mountains of evidence. They preclude only a couple of brief notes. Roughly 25% of Americans are not free from want. There are about 50 million households that struggle to pay for necessities, which include these days food, shelter, transportation, health care, and child care. And the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. But the bigger problem is structural. Starting with 1962, the marginal tax rate for those at the highest income levels has gradually decreased from 70% to what today is now 23%. If we take all taxes included, federal and state, and the mandatory fees, sales taxes, things that one must pay, the 400 richest families in the United States pay a lower tax rate than the poorest families in the United States. We have a new Ford Foundation president. His name is Darren Walker. He observed that such massive inequality breeds nothing except cynicism and hopelessness. And he said hopelessness is the greatest threat. Hopelessness is the greatest threat to American democracy. He said it's fair to be cynical about fairness because we have less. And then he said, this is going to sound snarky, but if you want the American dream, move to Canada. Canada has a higher degree of social and economic mobility than does the United States. There are about a dozen other countries that have higher degrees of mobility, socially, economically, than the United States. And then he says, in philanthropy, we're in the business of hope, and one pathway to hope is more justice. They are inextricably linked. As to freedom from fear, again, mountains of evidence preclude anything but a brief note. I'll make this one personal. One neighbor has guns. He and his wife go to a gallery and practice. They can handle themselves very well, and he believes that a civil war could break out any minute. Another neighbor, she has 3 young children. She takes them to Busch Gardens, and she says she's always on the lookout for a place where she and her children can take cover. Fear has also given us tiger moms, helicopter, and now bulldozer parents, and the liars and cheaters trying to get their children into prestigious colleges, and unfortunately that happens more than most of us would like to believe. They are preparing the road for the child, rather than preparing the child for the road. Everyone does it, they say. Yeah, it's partly true. But the other downside of the hyper-parenting was, I think, one of the sheets of paper you have. I'm going to just abbreviate it a bit. But it was spoken at a middle school graduation ceremony. It says, I hope you will be treated unfairly. Do you have that as a Okay, I can let you read it. It'll take a minute. I'm going to abbreviate it. You can take that one home with you. Let me tell you, I'll tell you at the end. I hope you'll be treated unfairly. You'll learn the value of justice. I hope you'll suffer betrayal. You'll learn the importance of loyalty. I wish you bad luck, so you'll be conscious of the role of chance in life and understand that your success is not completely deserved, and that the failure of others is not completely deserved either. When you lose, I hope an opponent will gloat so you'll understand the importance of sportsmanship. I hope you'll be ignored, thus learning to listen to others. I hope you will have just enough pain to learn compassion. These things will happen. I hope you learn them. John Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, speaking at his son's middle school graduation. The free-range children dilemma means that many parents are overprotecting their children from the unpleasant experiences that were listed above, and partly from violence. Can there be a parent anywhere that is not familiar with Sandy Hook, that is not familiar with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, is not familiar with many other schools and all kinds of places where people gather, including synagogues? Government institutions are implicated in all of those things, and they're failing. A novelist, Gilbert Chesterton, got underneath all of this, particularly the freedom from problem, and particularly freedom from want. He said this, it's one of my favorite quotes: "The poor have been rebels, but they have never been anarchists. They have more interest than anyone else in there being some decent government. Poor people really have a stake in the country. Rich people don't. They can go to New Guinea in a yacht. The poor have sometimes objected to being governed badly. The rich have always objected to being governed at all. And that is the foundation of so many justified grievances and a couple of Washington industries, one for tax avoidance and the other for what is called regulatory capture, which is to say that their clients don't like the regulations that are being proposed, so they pull the teeth out of those regulations so that they don't hurt the wealthy clients that are helping to write our laws. But, and this is John Locke, where there is no law, there is no freedom. Where law ends, tyranny begins. And Thomas Paine made that clear, that we need law and government, and this is from Common Sense, which was written in January of 1776. Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. Our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. Government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. For if the impulses of conscience were clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, we would need no other lawgiver. 2 centuries later, theologian Reinhold Niebuhr said, "The sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world." In short, if we hope to be free, we need government, and we need laws, and it appears that we are going to need more rather than less. We also need to free ourselves from illusion, a liberating experience, being free from what we know that ain't true, that we are the world's greatest democracy, that free markets solve all economic problems, that tax cuts pay for themselves, that we are God's chosen people, that we are invincible. Illusions always disappoint, bankrupting your soul, because we expect too much, and it just breeds more cynicism and hopelessness. Here I'm going to skate over some thin ice, speaking in public about religion and politics. But it is thin ice, I know that. We're not supposed to talk about religion and politics, except that we have to. We have to. What's the alternative? This is a universal. If not us, who? If not now, when? We have to talk about this because any other consequence will surely be dire. So you have a handout that I hope will maybe contribute to a conversation. You don't go out on thin ice without ropes and ladders. My ropes and ladders are Madison and Jefferson and George Mason. My ladder includes John Rawls' first principle of justice being the most extensive liberty compatible with a comparable liberty. For others, I bring with me Kant, who talks about rationality, dignity, and autonomy. Those are my ropes and ladders. John Mills, on liberty, said, if people possess any tolerable amount of common sense and experience, their own mode of laying out their existence is best. Not because it is the best in itself, but because it is their own. One religion and politics issue is assistance in dying. I'll not say more about that. That's in place now in 10 jurisdictions in the United States. I predict that New York State will adopt assistance in dying legislation in 2021. I won't bet on it. This is New York after all. But I think the odds are pretty favorable. The second and the much more contentious issue is abortion, with the state negating Rawls and Mills and Kant's rationality, dignity, and autonomy. Adding to that, Reinhold Niebuhr's observation, the tendency to claim God as an ally for our partisan values and ends is the source of all religious fanaticism. Think Westboro Baptist Church. Some of you may be familiar with that. But I'm going to let a historian address the issue. You have it in front of you. You can read it or not. But I learned quite a bit from reading that. The last freedom that I want to mention is freedom from appearing to be indifferent. We are not callous people, not here, but we may appear indifferent when we claim to be open-minded or neutral on matters where harm might be done. Elie Wiesel said, "We must take sides, as neutrality and science do not, neutrality and silence do not help victims, they help oppressors and tormentors." He says, you must take sides. And to do that, you must know what you're talking about. And to do that, you must do your homework, and who has time? There are millions of people who do not have time. Holding it together takes them every hour that they have of every day of every week. But some of us could find the time. But not having time means that we take our cues from the tribe and don't seek out the evidence, don't seek out the truth. Similarly, being oblivious looks very much like being indifferent. Again, the Ford Foundation President Walker, he said the best preparation he had for his new job, giving out money, was working as a bus person in a restaurant, bussing tables at age 13. He said, nobody saw me. Nobody spoke to me. I just cleared away plates and debris and was essentially nobody. And then he said, the perniciousness of systems that render people invisible is totally disheartening. And we render lots of people invisible because we don't see them, because we are somehow preoccupied elsewhere. Millions of people holding it together, other millions of people with cell phones that they turn on and off 50, 60, 70 times a day. Some people spending 7 hours in front of screens, and it's not their job. It's just their screens. And I learned a great lesson from a professor at Cortland named Milton Myeroff. He was here when I taught here, and this goes back to 1966, 7, 8. And Milton Myeroff said this in a lengthy essay called On Caring. He said, with the elimination of clutter, living becomes less complicated. Important connections between events are easily seen, and the significance of experience more readily comes home to us. There is a greater directness in life, and what is of real importance stands out more clearly. Without such clarity, deep-seated stability is impossible. And then he said, the meaning of my life is to be in place by virtue of caring. Caring for certain others, by serving them through caring. People live the meaning of their own lives. In the sense in which people can ever be said to be at home in the world, they are at home not through dominating or explaining or appreciating, but through caring and being cared for. Speakers at the forum on the future of democracy that I had the privilege of attending were cautiously optimistic about the future of democracy, cautiously optimistic because they recognized that, as Dylan sang, the times they are changing. And that is reflected in this changing generations. I am a member of the silent generation. Most of you are Gen Z. Many of you are millennials, and times they are a-changing. I'm sure most of you understand that institutional change takes place only when cultural change takes place, and we need to change our institutions. And most of you have probably heard Martin Luther King Jr.'s homily, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." This is generational change. You can see my generation on the silent generation. You can see where the millennials and Gen Z, there's a nice little staircase going in one direction or the other of how our culture is changing. This is from the Pew Charitable Trust. If you want to look at it, just put in Pew, P-E-W, and put in Gen Z or millennials, and you will get the whole picture. But they went through about a dozen of these kinds of things. You can see that ladder building one way or another. The times they are a-changing. All of this means that the gold in the vestibule is you guys. Sorry, you folks. You people. I'm trying to learn a new language here. In the silent generation, children were to be seen, not heard. In Gen Z, children will not be silenced. They will be heard, and they are being listened to. They are talking about their future. And most of you may know about Greta Thunberg speaking to the UN delegates, looking them in the eye and saying, "How dare you? How dare you compromise my future?" Going on right now, I haven't checked in the last 2 or 3 days, but there's a court case in the U.S. District for Oregon. Juliana versus the United States. Juliana is the first and the lead plaintiff. She's now 22. There are 21 plaintiffs in this case. The youngest plaintiff is 11. They come from 10 different states. Judge Ann Aiken recognized their constitutional right to a safe climate. And the plaintiffs were granted standing to sue in court based on depositions and evidence that they, in fact, had been harmed by changes in the climate. And it was all started with a nonprofit organization started by Julia Olson. Juliana and Julia and Judge Ann Aiken, 4 women. Excuse me, 3 women. Can't count. In the silent generation, a woman's place was in the home. In Gen Z, a woman's place is in your face.
Ooh.
She will be polite. She will not sacrifice her dignity to straighten you out. But she's not going away. You may be familiar with the name David Hogg, who has become the face and the spokesperson for the students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Poise, presence, and knowledge way beyond his years. And he always gives credit to women especially Black women, for their courage in pushing back against the gun culture which holds some of our politicians hostage. Armed with a passion for truth and justice, and maybe telepathy from gold looking at you, you can do this. I'm going to close with a couple of things here. This is from The Culture of Narcissism. It sounds contemporary, but it was written 40 years ago. Christopher Lasch, University of Rochester. He said, "The will to build a better society survives, along with traditions of localism, self-help, and community action that only needs the vision of a new society, a decent society, to give them new vigor. The moral discipline formerly associated with the work ethic still retains a value independent of the role it once played in defense of property rights. That discipline, indispensable to the task of building a new order, endures most of all in those who took the old order only as a broken promise, yet who took that promise more seriously than those who merely took it for granted. We have taken too much for granted for too long. It has landed us in the dark forest of the poet Dante's Inferno. The right path out appears nowhere. But if we get to work, if we have the moral courage, if we have the discipline, not to keep the faith, but to keep the promise, probably we can do this, but we are going to have to reach deep down. So we leave the poet Dante's Inferno, and we find a path out with the poet Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep. Miles to go before I sleep.
Thank you, Tom, for being this year's Metcalf Endowed Keynote speaker. Please enjoy the final sessions of this conference, and on behalf of myself and the Conference Planning Committee, we would like to thank you for attending this year's annual Cortland Recreation Conference. It has been a pleasure serving as this year's conference coordinator. Remember, we have a responsibility to future generations, and we must not forget our necessary contribution to society. Thank you.